Hi guys, Ken Smith, Ken Smith Fishing. So this is going to be one of my rabbit hole videos, and it's one of those things. This came from a conversation I was having with a young man the other day on the water, and there was a storm nearby, and he made a comment about the wind direction, and I responded back to him and said, no, that's not right. Let me, and here's why. And it just caused me to start thinking about what I know and kind of how I know it and how I fish and how fish react to changing pressure, specifically barometric pressure or atmospheric pressure, which are basically one and the same thing. And so the comment he made to me was there was a storm nearby, and he said something about he thought it was to the northwest, and he thought the wind would be coming out of the northwest. And I said to him, well, no, that's not really the case. I said the storm is low pressure, and wind wants to go to low pressure. I've always thought of it as sucking the wind. I don't think that's exactly right, but nature hates a vacuum, right? So that wind's going towards that low pressure front, or towards that storm, which is low pressure. So usually what you'll get right out in front of a storm. Now at a storm you may get any kind of wind direction, but when a storm's approaching, usually what you'll find is that wind is moving to that storm because that low pressure is pulling that wind there. So I have learned, mostly from fishing with some other really good fishermen over the years, certain things to do in summer, winter, fall, grass lakes, non-grass lakes, fishing for shallow fish, fishing for deep fish. And I just thought I would share with you kind of what I have learned, and learn might not be the right word, but kind of what I've observed over the years. But before we get there, I want to take you down the rabbit holes I went down, because this stuff interests me. As you guys know, I'm a little bit of a geek, certainly a math geek, and a little bit of a weather geek too. So the first thing to talk about is barometric pressure. Now, the sort of standard, if you will, barometric pressure is 29.92, I believe. I've got it in my notes here. It is, in fact, 29.92. So anything above 29.92 is considered high pressure. Anything below 29.92 is considered low pressure. Now, I'm going to read just for a second, because this is something that confused me, because I read somewhere else that the pressure at sea level around the world, if you will, is 14 point, and I got to find my notes again, 696 psi, pounds per square inch. And I was trying to convert those two. So here's what old Mr. Google says to me. So it says atmospheric pressure or barometric pressure is a pressure within the Earth's atmosphere. If you think about it, it makes sense, right? Gravity's pulling everything towards the Earth, and from the edge of space to the Earth, there's a whole lot of air. Well, gravity is pulling that air down, and that creates that 14.7 pounds per square inch of pressure at sea level. And quite obviously, if you think about that, the pressure at sea level would be much lower than the pressure at the top of Mount Everest at 27,000 feet, because there's less air on top of Mount Everest, above it, right, being pulled down, than there is at sea level. Now, where I got hung up was, what's the difference between that PSI and barometric pressure? So this is what I learned. The standard atmosphere unit is defined, and by the way, the symbol for it is ATM, just like what you go to ATM, is measured by something called a PA or a Pascal. And a Pascal is a unit of pressure defined as 101,325 PAs, which is 1,013, let me make sure I get that one right, metric units of pressure. Which is equivalent to something else, which is equivalent to 29.9212 inches of mercury, and a barometer uses mercury to measure the barometric pressure. So that 29.92 is equivalent to 14.696 psi. So said another way, if the barometric pressure at sea level is 29.92, kind of that mid-level, then you have 14.9, sorry guys, got to keep referring to my notes, 696 pounds per square inch, okay? Now, anything above that is high pressure, anything below that is low pressure. How does that affect fish? Well, here's how that affects fish. And by the way, if you Google it, you'll find that there's a lot of stuff talking on the internet about the fact that changes in barometric pressure can create headaches. And I have a friend who suffers from migraines, and they've stated to me before that a lot of times they get migraines coming on when a pressure system's approaching, and that will trigger those migraines, which I think is really interesting. And it was another rabbit hole I went down that I won't take you guys down. But it has an impact on a fish, and here's why. So a fish largely moves up and down through the water column by swimming, granted, but when they want to stabilize somewhere, they add or subtract air to their swim bladder. Okay, so it's a sac in them that when they want to go up, they just like a diver, right? A diver drops weights. Well, a fish does it the opposite way by adding air. So when they want to go up in the water column, they add air. When they want to go down, they drop air. Now, if you remember our conversation, who was this with? With John Hope. So it was actually an article I wrote, but it was from a conversation with John Hope. If you don't know John Hope, he wrote a great book called Tracking Texas Trophies. He was the first guy in Texas who was licensed by the Texas Park and Wildlife to put radio transmitters in fish and track them. Most of the fish he tracked were trophy quality fish. Some of them were tournament quality, but most of them, I believe the biggest fish he tracked was Dennis Canada's 15-pound fish, Missy, who they tracked for 3 or 4 years in Fort. Missy was a 15-plus pound fish, but they tracked a lot of giant fish for a long time. They being John and his team, but mostly John actually. But one of the things John said to me was, in all of his observations, now we've talked about this before, right? Mine and your observations generally of fish are either in an aquarium or in the fish we catch. We don't get to see the 99.9% of fish that we don't catch what they're doing, which, by the way, is why I continue to find the tracking study Todd Driscoll's doing right now in Toledo Bend so fascinating. If you've not seen any of that, check that link right there. Todd and I are going to try to get together again here in the next few weeks when we're down at Rayburn and continue what they saw through the spawn. But what John said from all of his time tracking those fish was, he said fish would move up and down in the water column to feed a lot of feet. He said 10 or 15 feet was not unusual to see them. He said, but when they went back to their rest period, he never saw them vary that. He said usually by more than 3 feet, and he said never by more than 5 feet. So if you think about that, if a fish is suspended in pole timber 10 feet down on a 30-foot tree, what he's saying is that fish might go up here or down here to feed. But when it came back to rest, it basically came back to rest somewhere between 13 feet and 16 feet, 7 feet and 13 feet, somewhere in that range of within about 3 feet of where they first started tracking that fish. And he said his assumption or his belief based upon those observations were it was because of their swim bladder. It was difficult for them to, I don't know if purge is the right word, but change that swim bladder enough where they would be comfortable in that same space. So if they went up to the top to feed, they wouldn't just stay there. They would go up and feed for just a couple of minutes and they'd come right back down. So what that translates to me about barometric pressure is this. Well, let's talk about this for a second. So rising air, when air is rising up, that leads to low pressure at the surface. Makes perfect sense, right? The air's rising, so it's taking the pressure off the air from above. So you have a lower pressure at the surface. When air is dropping, you have high pressure. High pressure is when it gets hard to catch fish. And if you think about that, with high pressure, that pressure is pressing down on that fish and on their swim bladder, and therefore making them uncomfortable. For lack of a better word, giving them a headache. But really what it does, and I've seen a lot of videos and read a lot of stuff that says it makes the fish feel bloated. Now, you can't go ask a fish that and they say, man, I really feel bloated. But something occurs that makes those fish become more lethargic and feed less. So a couple of observations, and by the way, likewise, when that pressure turns around, right, and when that pressure starts rising, it relaxes that swim bladder, they become more comfortable, and they start feeding again. Now, by the way, usually speaking, high pressure air rising is calm, clear conditions, usually not terribly windy. Low pressure, when that air is coming down, is when clouds form, is when you get rain, when you get thunder and lightning, when you get storms, and when you get wind. So I think personally, I believe most of our fish across the country, largemouth and especially smallmouth, the smallmouth is such a different animal because they feed in the sunshine so much better. But mostly, I think you get better fishing for several reasons in those low pressure situations. Number one, they're more comfortable with their swim bladder. Number two, you get wind, so you get more activity, which moves plankton, which moves bait fish, which moves large fish, which moves the fish that feed on the fish that feed on the fish, right? I also think fish get less bait wary. They can't see your line as well. They can't see the hooks on your line as well because you have lower light and you have more turbidity in the water. I think I just made a word up. You have more stuff moving around, so they don't get as good a look at a bait in a low pressure situation with any kind of cloud cover, any kind of rain, any kind of lower light than what they get in a high pressure system. So the other thing, so let's talk about, generally speaking, what I have seen occur when you get those high pressure situations. Fish get much harder to catch. Number one, they feel like crap, right? They got that pressure on their swim bladder. My belief, my observations over the years have been this. So at the surface of the water, you have one atmosphere, okay, 14.6 psi. 10 meters down, roughly 32, 33 feet down, you have two atmospheres. So you have double the pressure on a fish, and then it doubles again as you go down again. Okay, so this is really a rabbit hole. And I'm in the edit on this video, and I read this, and I think, well, that means this, and then this means this. So one of you guys will know the answer to this question. My buddy Jerry Darren, who used to fly for the Blue Angels, would know the answer to this question, but he can't talk. My buddy Scott, who is a scuba diver and a pilot, didn't know the answer to this question, but he said, I've never flown that high. So here's my thought. So the pressure at sea level is called one atmosphere, okay? So if that's one atmosphere, and if you go to 10 meters, roughly 33 feet deep, that's two atmospheres. So then it started making me think, what if you went up? How far would you have to go to get to 0 atmospheres? And it looks to me like everything I read here says to the top of the stratosphere, about 30, 31, 32 miles, gets you down to 99, so basically 1% atmosphere. So in my mind then, I start thinking about the pressure on these fish, that from 1 foot to 33 feet would be like me going from 0 feet from sea level to 50, 60, or 30 miles up in the air. So I think you guys kind of get where I'm going there. One of you guys will know the answer to this, but I believe that is correct, that going down 33 feet doubles the pressure, and to do the opposite, to get rid of all pressure, you'd have to go to the top of the stratosphere, which again suggests to me how much less pressure that little bit of air pressure has on fish once they get down that far. Just a little bit of a crazy thought. I'll go back to my video now. There you go, rabbit hole in a rabbit hole, or it increases again as you go down. But if you think about that, a fish deeper obviously will have less air in their swim bladder, and they have more pressure on them already, so they are less impacted by that down pressure from the air pressure above. My experience has been fish at depth, and 30 more than 20 and 20 more than 10 and 10 certainly much less than its surface. The deeper you go, the less susceptible fish are to shutting down on high pressure systems. I think again that goes back to the other comment. I think as you go deeper you get less light penetration, so they become less bait wary because again they can't see your line, they can't see the hooks as well. So my initial reaction, and I'm as guilty as anybody about practicing for the conditions that are happening that day. But when I know I'm on the last day of a low pressure and I got a high pressure bluebird day coming first day of tournaments, I will do my very best to focus on those deeper fish. And generally speaking, so a lot of times you get suspended fish, But a lot of times those fish will go as deep in that area as they can possibly get to minimize that pressure on their swim bladder, which is, in my opinion, why they will get super tight to the bottom. So not one of the best days of fishing, one of my proudest tournaments I've ever had is a picture that sits here on my desk that you guys can't see. And I love this picture. If you guys remember the TV show, My Name is Earl, every time Earl had his picture made, his eyes are closed. My eyes are closed in this picture. Y'all probably getting a glare on that. But that's a day back in January of 2015, I believe. Yeah, that's right, January 2015. I was fishing with my buddy Skip Chancellor out of Houston. We were on Rayburn, and it was extremely cold. And by the way, so cold air is denser than warm air. So on the colder days, you get more pressure on those fish, right? You get higher barometer because you have more pressure coming down, you get a higher barometric pressure, meaning more pressure pushing down on those fish. So on cold days, which by the way is, I believe, why cold fronts in the winter are much worse than cool fronts in the summer, because there's more pressure coming down because that air is so much colder. 30-degree air is a lot cold, a lot denser than 80-degree air when you go from 180 in a summer cold front. But on that day, Skip and I had been fishing a main lake point about 23, 24 feet deep on top, and the fish weren't there. They just weren't biting. And at one point during the day, we were sitting in 36 feet of water, and I worked my bait. I had thrown an A-rig out, backed away from it to get as far out there as I could, and I would take that A-rig and I would turn it about 3 or 4 handle cranks and let it fall back to the bottom. 3 or 4 handle cranks and let it fall back to the bottom. And I did that literally until it was directly under the boat. And when I reeled it out the bottom, I felt the fish load up on it. And I told Skip, I said, there's one. And I fought the fish for just a second, and all of a sudden it double loaded. I mean, I felt it got really heavy. And it was a 6-pounder and a 3-pounder. And I remember that day, I was looking at my graph, and I looked at Skip and I said, holy cow. I said, look at this. And I blew up, I zoomed, and the fish were so tight to the bottom, I couldn't see them unless I zoomed 2x. And basically took the screen from the bottom being that big to the bottom being that big, and you could see those fish down there. And we turned around there and caught 2868 in about an hour and a half. I actually turned the boat, got out a 3/4 ounce football jig, and started throwing it to the same 36 feet depth and just fishing it down that bottom, and we spanked on them. And I believe that was because those fish had backed off of the side of that point to the deepest water they could get to, because it was the most comfortable place for them to be from a swim bladder standpoint. So my experiences on high pressure, barometric pressure days, the fish will go deeper, or they will go, and certainly we've seen this in Florida. If you go back, there's a great video when Bradley Hallman won an FLW event in Florida. He was flipping, it was a high pressure day, he was flipping the thickest stuff he could find. Now again, in Florida, those fish can't move 50 horizontal yards and get in much deeper water. So they go under stuff. Rayburn fish will do the same thing. That may be something to do with the Florida strain. Florida strain fish, they want to live shallow, they want to feed shallow. But my experience is they want to move under stuff. And my experience also is counter to everything I've ever read. They want a fast-moving bait. Now, I don't think they want a fast-moving bait. I think their instincts cause them to react to a fast-moving bait. Again, if you go back on that Hallman video, he was flipping a 1 1/4, 1 1/2 ounce. That's been my experience. When those fish get under stuff, I don't want to give them a chance of something floating by for them to think about it. I want them to bite it because they just react to it as instinctual. Something went through their space. Something else I've experienced specifically on Rayburn and Toledo, when this happens and the fish have committed January, February even, to be up and around the grass, you can absolutely catch them on a jerkbait, which is that reaction bite. But my experience has been, believe it or not, a chrome rattle trap fished as fast as you can fish it. And a friend of mine was telling me the other day about this, that there's a video out there somewhere where Rick Clunn talks about catching fish in 37 to, God, was it that cold? No, it was 47 to 51 degree water temperature. Anywhere he could get around pole timber, taking a 2.5 size crankbait and burning it. And for some reason, those fish will suspend around that stuff. And again, same thing, they just react to those baits. So the lesson for you, I believe, that I have learned over the years, my observations are, either really speed up your presentation if you believe those fish are still shallow. And by the way, obviously, with some of the forward-looking technology now, you can see sometimes if those fish are still shallow. And or, if that doesn't work, get out into the deepest area you can find and look for those fish out there in the area that you found them in practice in. And it's smart, if you can, to ignore as much as you can. If you know in practice day that you're going to have a significant pressure change the next day, practice for the pressure and the wind you're going to have the next day, not for the day you're practicing. Because you got to catch them in those conditions. And it's a lesson I learned on Rayburn over many, many years, that if I know there's going to be a big wind in one direction or the other, I will absolutely ignore anything. I can't fish the next day in that big wind in, because I'm just wasting my practice time. I'm just amazed how many guys say, my area got blown out. Seriously? There's every weather app you could ever want right here. If you don't have this app, actually, and this is just something my buddy Dickie put me on, there's an app called Fish Weather, and it will give you really accurate wind forecast with sustained winds and gust. It's a no-brainer to have this on your phone, and it's a great tool, again, for you to help think about when you're practicing where you should be practicing for the tournament next day. So I hope that helps you. I hope that's a little bit more understanding about pressure. By the way, just as an aside, I found this interesting as I'm reading. The highest pressure ever recorded was in 1968 at 32.01 barometric pressure. That was in Siberia on a perfectly clear, very cold day. I suspect very cold day. It didn't define it, but I bet you it was well below zero. And the lowest ever was in a typhoon in the Pacific Ocean in 1979 at 25.9. So that's just something I found interesting. Doesn't mean anything to your eye, but you guys know when I go down these rabbit holes, I read a lot of stuff. So I hope you guys found that interesting. We're going to start our Bass Cat Factory tour this week. You know what? Before we go there, let's do a spark drawing right here. Okay, so spark drawing for this week is for everybody. So whether you're a Spark Fishing affiliate member, or whether you're a Spark customer, or whether you just went to Spark Fishing and entered your information to get in the drawing here, everybody's in this pot. So this week, $250 winner of Spark money is Kevin Slate out of Slate, S-L-A-T-E, out of Choctaw, Oklahoma. So Kevin, thanks for watching Ken Smith Fishing. Thanks for getting to the Spark Bass website, entering your name and your contact information. Don't throw away an envelope here in a couple of weeks that says Rewards Center at the top, because it's going to have a $250 gift card coming for you from Spark Fishing. Only 2 names so far in the Spark Big Bass for the year. Remember, 9 lakes. Matter of fact, I'm going to post a video to talk a little bit more about that. So you guys stick around. I'll get that video up hopefully this week, if not for sure next week. Thanks, guys.